Governor Ron DeSantis perhaps signed the most consequential piece of legislation of his entire term as governor, and that was a 6-week abortion ban in the state of Florida. So we're going to take a look at what this ban actually entails and how this is likely to impact Ron DeSantis in his run for president, both in the primary election and the general. So we're going to get into what the law entails in just a second, but of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So this is basically the most restrictive abortion law Florida has had thus far. They previously had a 15-week ban with no exceptions. Now this 6-week ban maintains exceptions for rape, incest, life of the mother up till 15 weeks. So it's not a complete abortion ban. There are exceptions, but those exceptions run out at the 15-week mark. Now, in terms of how this legislation will impact Governor DeSantis in Florida, that of course remains to be seen. Florida is still a state that views DeSantis pretty highly. He's still very popular in the state. Obviously, we'll see if his approval takes a hit or not from this piece of legislation. There's very many people in Republican circles that definitely didn't want this bill to get to the governor's desk, because him signing it definitely puts him in a tight situation come the general election, because Democrats just have the more popular position on abortion, generally speaking. You know, Republicans always have to be seemingly on defense on this issue, and I think that's not necessarily the best approach if Republicans do sort of push for more quote-unquote common sense abortion restrictions while putting their opponents on defense. I think that's a slightly better strategy, but if the midterms told us anything, it's that oftentimes when Republicans put themselves in a tough spot on abortion in particular, there's massive consequences. We could take a look at the state of Michigan as a prime example. Trudeau Dixon's views on abortion were well outside the mainstream. She said a number of things that really didn't go well with the Michigan electorate, which, by the way, is massively pro-choice. Trudeau Dixon basically was one of those candidates that was pushing an abortion ban with basically zero exceptions. And of course, this is how Michigan responded. You know, Gretchen Whitmer was an incumbent, but this race certainly could have been a lot closer with a candidate with better messaging on the issue of abortion. We could also look at the state of Pennsylvania, in which you had Doug Mastriano, the Republican nominee, essentially say that women who have abortions should be put in jail and tried for murder. So obviously, as you can see, that did not play well with the general electorate. And, you know, we could go on and on with congressional races, with local races. But at the end of the day, Republicans who push this position, abortion with no exceptions, find themselves in a pretty tricky spot. You know, outside of the South, it's a very, very unpopular position. We could just take a look at some opinion polling by the Pew Research Center on abortion. If we go by state, of course, you know, in states like Alabama, having abortion be illegal is actually the more popular position. You know, same as in Arkansas, same in Georgia. In fact, Georgia, that's actually pretty surprising to me, to be honest. That's probably one of the reasons why Kemp signing the heartbeat bill in Georgia really didn't hurt him all that much. But as you go on throughout the list, you'll notice all of the states essentially where abortion is illegal in most cases, or at least should be illegal in most cases through the eyes of the voters, are southern state. And it's odd that Kentucky's on here, because the abortion referendum that essentially would have done that actually failed in the state of Kentucky. But, you know, looking at the rest of these states, you know, Michigan, as you can see here, only 42% of the population wanted it illegal in all or most cases. The majority wanted it obviously in favor. If we take a look at Florida on this list, 56% of Floridians want abortion legal in all or most cases. Just 39% want it illegal. So Florida, in some ways, is more pro-choice than Michigan, and yet this 6-week abortion ban was passed in the state of Florida. So, you know, Ron DeSantis, I think, in passing this, really, I don't know if he weighed the consequences of this electorally. I think DeSantis is somebody who's sort of driven by conviction and his moral values on the issue of abortion. He's a religious Catholic. He opposes abortion politically, religiously. So I think that's ultimately why he signed this. But from a political standpoint, it does put him in a tricky position come the general election. Now, looking at the primary election, currently Donald Trump, the former president, is heavily favored. I mean, he's up in the polls anywhere from 23 to 26 percentage points. The latest poll from Morning Consult has him up 56-23, obliterating the competition, obliterating DeSantis. And this really wasn't always the case. There was a brief period of time where DeSantis was relatively competitive. But if you look at the trend overall, Donald Trump has always been the favorite, and now it looks like he's becoming more and more of the favorite as time goes on here. So DeSantis surely needs to shore up his base in order to actually put a coalition together to actually beat Donald Trump in the primary. Because as I mentioned, Donald Trump is the heavy favorite. Now, what base is Ron DeSantis courting? He's courting social conservatives and evangelicals. It's very clear just by the positions he takes in general, the type of governor he is, but also this abortion bill was certainly red meat to these types of voters, because this is exactly the legislation they're looking for. Now, again, DeSantis is in primary mode. He's basically running for president. He hasn't said yet, probably waiting until the legislative session is over. But this is no doubt a big victory for him in terms of the Republican primary, because this is an area where I think he can outflank Donald Trump from the right. Now, Donald Trump has other electoral problems, I think, in the general, but one of them isn't abortion. Donald Trump is not very conservative on abortion. He's not a very religious person, so it's not something I think he values as very important. Whereas Ron DeSantis is very much sort of an old guard, social conservative, pro-life, that sort of thing. So the two men are very different on this issue. I think in a lot of ways, the average voter would not see Donald Trump's view on abortion as sort of outside the mainstream in a way that they might see DeSantis's, because DeSantis is just more conservative on this issue, at least in policy and rhetorically. But in terms of the primary, DeSantis really needs something like this to give him a competitive edge over Donald Trump, because it's April right now. Obviously, there's many months before votes actually start being cast throughout the country. But it's very clear that he's falling behind. And, that little bit of momentum he got after the midterm disaster for Republicans, in which many Republicans blamed Donald Trump and his candidates for that. Once that sort of dissipated, and especially with the indictment, Donald Trump has sort of benefited from this so-called rally around the flag effect, with essentially Republicans being very galvanized to come back and support Donald Trump, because they see him as being persecuted by the Democrats, and it sort of bolsters his narrative that he tries to present to Republican voters, that he's the only person that can stop the swamp and the Democrats and this whole thing. So it's very important to his image. But Ron DeSantis is really hoping and banking on the fact that this is going to help him in the primary election. Now, when we turn to the general, again, as I pointed out earlier in 2022, abortion was not a good issue for Republicans in Michigan and Pennsylvania, but there are abortion strategies that tended to work. Of course, in the state of Georgia, Brian Kemp passed a heartbeat bill. He ended up beating Stacey Abrams very soundly. Now, abortion, I don't think, was the forefront issue in this race. Correct me if I'm wrong. But even still, governor's races are very different than presidential contests. And I believe the Georgia electorate was actually an R+3 electorate, or R+4. So you had a much more Republican electorate than you did in 2020. But regardless, Brian Kemp took a hardline stance against abortion in Georgia, and he was reelected for it. Now, I don't think that's the only issue, but that was certainly one of the issues. Now, I think where people get a bit confused on this issue is that abortion was not the number one issue in Georgia, nor was it the number one issue in Ohio. Governor DeWine passed a pretty restrictive abortion law as well. Texas also passed a pretty restrictive abortion law. That was a big issue, as well as gun control. Abbott won pretty soundly. But these are incumbent governors who are already pretty popular to begin with. The abortion stuff didn't really hurt their popularity. DeSantis, I don't really think this is going to give him a massive hit in approval. We'll see, of course. But running the state of Florida in some ways is very different than running the nation. Now, of course, you could argue that DeSantis is the reason that Florida is such a red state now, that coupled with outstate migrants coming into the state of Florida. But I mean, if you take a look at the governor's map for the state of Florida, Ron DeSantis won re-election by nearly 20 percentage points. That's historic for a Republican. And he won in a lot of areas that Republicans aren't winning in anymore. Places like Hillsborough County winning by 9 points, a suburban county that's been blue for quite some time now. Osceola County, this county's been blue for decades on the presidential level. Duval County, this is a formerly conservative county that has since drifted left. He won back pretty handedly, so on and so forth. And I believe this was after the 15-week abortion bill. So really, we'll have to wait and see how this is received by Floridians, but there's still a lot of time until 2024. I would say, unless DeSantis plays his cards right, this is probably going to hurt him. The question is how much. Again, we kind of said that back in 2022 at Dobbs, and Dobbs turned out to be a pretty major issue for Republicans, especially when they had really bad positions or bad messaging on it, i.e. Tudor Dixon, i.e. Doug Mastriano. So it really remains to be seen how this is going to impact the general. Of course, there's a lot of time, but My inclination is that it probably hurts DeSantis. I don't think it totally dooms his campaign. It really depends how he decides to navigate it if he does become the Republican nominee. And of course, as we look at the polling right now, he's certainly not favored to be the Republican nominee. But nonetheless, he's probably the only other person besides Donald Trump that would be the nominee. So it remains to be seen, of course, what the impact of this is going to be. But of course, leave your thoughts down below, comment down below. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel if you like what you see. Hit the bell notification if you enjoyed this video. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.